My name is Malik, and today I will be your narrator, especially for the Red Beret channel. What I'm about to share with you isn't just news. It's a moment that shook 2 continents, a comment made in front of cameras, and a response that stunned the world. It began with a smirk, a pause. Then the words spilled out. Africa. What has Africa ever done for the world? The man who said them? Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. The world heard. But one man listened deeper. One man did not stay silent. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. His reply? It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was something no one expected. And when he spoke, when he finally stood before the world and answered, that moment became history. Because sometimes the most powerful responses aren't made with insults. They're made with vision. Before the media storm, before the speeches and the applause, Ibrahim Traoré was just a boy with a dusty pair of sandals and a mother who taught him the value of quiet strength. Born in a small village in Burkina Faso, his life began far from the halls of power. There were no silver spoons or polished promises waiting for him. What he had instead was soil under his nails, the heat of the dry season in his lungs, and the relentless discipline of survival. His mother, Awa, was a market vendor. She sold roasted peanuts under a faded umbrella on a corner of a noisy market. His father, a farmer with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many failed harvests, passed away when Ibrahim was still a child. And just like that, he became the man of the house. But he didn't complain. That wasn't his way. He watched his mother rise before the sun, boil water over a fire, count coins like prayers, and stretch every meal to feed 2 mouths instead of 1. She never said she was tired, but her shoulders always looked like they were carrying more than just baskets. From her, he learned what it meant to give without boasting, to serve without asking. Ibrahim's childhood wasn't tragic, it was honest. There were nights without electricity, but there was laughter. There was hunger, yes, but also pride. He studied by candlelight, scribbling notes on the back of used paper. Teachers noticed him early, not for loudness, but for intensity. He had questions that went deeper than the curriculum, a gaze that didn't wander even when the classroom was falling apart. He was the kind of student who sat in the front, not for praise, but because he wanted to see better, hear better, understand better. When he got his first pair of shoes that weren't second-hand, he didn't wear them to school immediately. He kept them in a box for weeks, only bringing them out on exam day as if wearing them gave him strength. As he grew older, Ibrahim became fascinated with the idea of discipline. He joined youth groups, helped organize local cleanups, taught younger kids how to read. But the world outside his village was changing fast. Political instability, corruption, leaders who said the right things but did little. Still, he watched, listened, took notes, and when the time came, he chose the military, not out of desire for power, but because it was one of the only institutions that still promised order. He trained hard, harder than most. Not because he was desperate to rise, but because he believed every bullet dodged and every mission completed might help his people sleep better at night. In the army, he was quiet, focused, relentless. Superiors noticed his ability to lead not with fear, but with purpose. He was the one who stayed behind to help injured comrades, the one who memorized maps others forgot, the one who asked why they were fighting, not just who. And over time, soldiers started following him even when orders weren't clear. He didn't seek their loyalty, he earned it. But it wasn't the military alone that shaped him. It was the contradictions of the country he loved. He saw villages without clean water while politicians drove past in imported cars. He saw children walking 10 kilometers to school while government buildings sat empty with working AC. He saw NGOs come and go, promising everything, delivering little. And yet his people endured. Not with resentment, but with resilience. It broke his heart. It fueled his fire. At night, after long days in training or on the field, he would return to his small quarters and write letters to himself, notes about what needed to change, dreams about what leadership could look like if it was rooted in love, not legacy. He didn't know yet that these thoughts would one day shape policy. He just knew they mattered. And in all of this, Ibrahim never lost his connection to where he came from. He visited his village often, spoke with the elders, sat under the same mango tree where he once did homework. He never forgot their names, never forgot who raised him. That grounding became his armor. When others lost themselves in ambition, he remembered what his mother used to whisper when money was short but hope wasn't. We don't have much, but what we have, we protect. So when he became leader, when the people called on him to take charge during one of the country's darkest political chapters, he didn't do it with fanfare. He did it with intention. He didn't move into the presidential palace right away. He kept his old cot, wore the same uniform, ate the same meals. Because for him, leadership wasn't about distance, it was about presence. That's who Ibrahim Traoré was before the headlines. A man carved by silence, raised by integrity, and built not in conference rooms, but on dirt roads, under tin roofs, beside women who carried water and never asked for medals. And when Donald Trump, thousands of miles away, dismissed Africa with a smirk, Traoré didn't feel anger first. He felt sorrow. Sorrow that the world still didn't see, that they looked and didn't understand. But he didn't stay silent for long. Because Traoré wasn't just the president of a country, he had become the voice of millions, and he was about to speak, not for himself, but for every child who had ever studied by candlelight, every mother who had sacrificed in silence, every continent that had been misnamed and misunderstood. The world was watching, and he was ready. The comment didn't come as a surprise. It was just another line buried in a long history of dismissals. Another moment when Africa was spoken about, not spoken to. But this time it echoed louder. Trump had stood before cameras and referred to African nations in a tone drenched in mockery, calling them places of failure, of dysfunction, of chaos. The words were said off script, casual, almost laughing. But what followed was anything but funny. Media outlets spun it into breaking news. Politicians either avoided the topic or stoked it further. Pundits argued over whether it was racist or just blunt. But across Africa, it landed like an insult that had finally broken the skin. People were tired of being misunderstood, tired of being overlooked, tired of being summarized by stereotypes and summarized by men who had never walked their streets, touched their soil, tasted their struggle, or seen their strength. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré heard the words too. Not from a newspaper or advisor, but from a young man in a village school who asked him directly, "Mr. President, is it true that they think we are nothing?" The question cut deeper than the insult itself, because it wasn't about Trump, it was about perception. About a generation growing up in a world where their value was measured by the words of foreign leaders. And that day, Traoré didn't have an answer. Not because he was speechless, but because he knew that words would not be enough. So he said nothing, at least not right away. While the world waited for a response, Ibrahim disappeared from the cameras. He cancelled 3 public events, declined media requests, ignored pressure from his own team to release a statement. "We must answer firmly," they said. "The world expects a reaction." But he refused to be baited. He was not going to throw back insults like spears. He was going to build something no insult could reach. 3 days later, Traoré appeared in a village in the south where few presidents had ever stepped foot. No red carpet, no security barrier, just him, his press team, and the people. He didn't arrive in a limousine. He rode in a dust-covered pickup truck and wore the same boots he had worn in the military. There, in the village square, he sat on a wooden bench beside a young girl, showing him a solar-powered lantern she had built from scrap metal and recycled plastic bottles. Her name was Aminata. She was 13. When asked what inspired her invention, she simply said, "I didn't want my brother to go blind from kerosene smoke like my uncle did." Traoré asked her how she learned. She pointed to a chalkboard under a mango tree. The teacher had no laptop, no Wi-Fi, just chalk, grit, and a belief that knowledge can grow even in dry soil. A cameraman captured the moment. No speeches, no fanfare. Just a leader listening to a child, a man witnessing the power of the people he served. That footage was posted quietly to a government page. The caption said, "Africa is not poor. Africa is rich in silence." That one line was shared over 4 million times in 3 days. It hit a nerve, because it wasn't defensive, it wasn't loud. It was true. Africa was not the problem. It was the answer waiting to be seen. Traoré didn't need to shout back. He needed only to show what had always been there. The brilliance hidden beneath ignorance, the innovation masked by media, the pride that doesn't ask for applause. Then came the surprise. A week later, Traoré called for a national broadcast. But it wasn't held in a palace. It wasn't filmed in a studio. It was shot in the very same village where Aminata lived. The backdrop was a blackboard, dusty from use. In his hand was a worn-out book of African poetry. And when the cameras rolled, he read a single verse aloud. "We are not shadows cast by others. We are light that never asked for permission to shine." After the reading, he closed the book, looked directly into the camera and said, "To those who mock us, we will not respond with mockery. We will respond by showing you who we are, and that will be enough." The silence that followed was deafening. There was no applause, no music, just the image of Traoré standing barefoot in the red earth of his homeland, staring into a lens that broadcasted his dignity to the world. That video became a moment, a movement. Schools played it in morning assembly, radio stations translated it into over 30 dialects. African youth, those who had once felt small, stood a little taller, because someone had answered an insult not with anger, but with pride, not with noise, but with depth. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a briefing room where monitors played news loops from around the world, a clip of Traoré's statement played silently. One aide turned to another and asked, "Did we just start something we can't finish?" Because Traoré hadn't just responded. He had reframed the conversation. He had taken a global insult and turned it into a mirror. And the world finally had to look. Ibrahim Traoré had always understood the weight of silence, but he also knew when a moment demanded words. After the quiet reply that had already moved millions, he prepared for something more deliberate, more public. A direct yet dignified response not to Trump as a man, but to everything that his comment symbolized. It wasn't about revenge or reclaiming image. It was about reaffirming the soul of a continent that had been mislabeled for far too long. The perfect stage came sooner than expected, an invitation to speak at an international economic summit in Dakar, Senegal. Leaders from Europe, Asia, and North America were scheduled to attend. Media coverage would be global. The timing precise, the pressure immense. The morning of the speech, the air was heavy with anticipation. Traoré wore traditional Fasodan fani, hand-woven by artisans from the countryside. It wasn't just fashion, it was a declaration of origin. He stepped onto the stage not as a politician, but as a son of Africa. The auditorium was filled with suits and cameras. Behind the scenes, diplomats whispered predictions. Would he lash out? Would he avoid the subject altogether? He began without a script, without notes, without teleprompters, just his voice. He started slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here today. I come to speak not only as a president, but as a witness of my people, of our land, and of the stories often untold." His tone was calm, steady. I know many of you have seen the headlines, heard the quotes. Perhaps you expect a defense, perhaps even a rebuke, but I offer you neither. I offer instead a window. And with that, Traoré painted a picture. He spoke of the gold mined by hands that never see wealth, of the cacao harvested by children who never taste chocolate, of cotton grown in sun-scorched fields that ends up on luxury runways across oceans. Africa, he said, has never been poor. It has been pillaged, exploited, repackaged and resold, but never poor. The room grew still. He continued, when someone says we have given nothing to the world, I invite them to look deeper. We gave the world rhythms that built music, languages that shaped philosophy, civilizations that mapped the stars before the telescope had a name. But more than what we gave, let me tell you what we still carry. We carry community in places where the state abandoned us. We carry hope when systems forget us. We carry laughter in hunger and resilience in sorrow. There was no anger in his delivery, just truth, heavy and elegant. He paused briefly and then addressed the deeper wound. Some believe that by mocking us, they gain power. But power built on ignorance is like a house built on sand. It falls when the storm comes. And we Africans have survived every storm. Colonialism, slavery, debt, disease, betrayal. Yet here we stand. Not as victims, but as architects of tomorrow. At this point, cameras zoomed in. Reporters leaned forward. The world, it seemed, was listening. Traoré reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden figurine, roughly carved, old. He held it up. This was made by my grandfather, he said. He sold it for the equivalent of $1 to a tourist decades ago. That same carving now sits in a glass museum case in Europe. No name, no context, just a label. Primitive art. But there is nothing primitive about my people's creativity, nothing primitive about our stories. He looked out across the room and asked, when will the world stop collecting our pain and start honoring our presence? A pause, a long one. And then, with all eyes locked on him, Traoré concluded with words no one saw coming. Mr. Trump, he said, not with spite but with poise. I do not answer you with insult, because your words have already answered themselves. I answer you by reminding the world that ignorance spoken loudly does not silence truth spoken quietly. And Africa's truth is not a whisper, it is a drumbeat. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. They were frozen in reflection. The applause, when it came, wasn't explosive. It was rising, wave by wave, until it became thunderous. Traoré stood still, composed. He had not clapped back. He had elevated the stage. His words were not just a response, they were a reckoning. In the hours that followed, news networks looped the speech on repeat. Commentators from Paris to Nairobi hailed it as one of the most measured, profound replies ever made by an African leader on a global stage. But for Traoré, the mission wasn't over. After the summit, he didn't return to his office. He traveled directly to a technical school outside of Ouagadougou, where young engineers were learning to build irrigation systems for their villages. He sat with them, asked questions, watched as one of the girls demonstrated a water purification unit made from recycled glass and sand. He smiled and told her, "The world will know your name before they know mine." That was his response too. Not just the speech, but the follow-through. Traoré understood that changing perception was not about one moment, it was about consistency. You dismantle a stereotype not with one reply, but with 100 truths repeated in action. So he kept showing up, kept shining a light on his people, not for pity but for pride, because the world needed to see Africa, not in shadows but in spotlight, not as charity but as change. And when asked later why he chose to speak the way he did, Traoré simply said, "Because we are not what they call us. We are what we choose to become." In the days that followed Traoré's speech, the world began to shift, not in massive explosions of change, but in small, undeniable ways. In classrooms across Africa, teachers paused their regular lessons to play clips from the summit. Students sat in silence, eyes wide, listening to a man in traditional cloth speak about their worth as if it were the most natural truth in the world. It wasn't just pride, it was recognition. Many of them had never seen someone in power speak about Africa, not in terms of what it lacked, but in terms of what it was, what it had always been. Some students cried quietly, some clapped, and some for the first time raised their hands not to ask what they should do with their lives, but to say, "I want to be like him." Social media exploded with quotes from the speech. Artists created murals overnight. One painting in Ghana showed Traoré holding a lantern, lighting the faces of a diverse group of African children. In Nigeria, a spoken word artist went viral, performing a piece titled "We Are Not Your Joke." In Rwanda, a high school debate team opened their championship round with his quote, "Ignorance spoken loudly does not silence truth spoken quietly." But it wasn't just youth. Elders who had lived through coups and colonization wept as they watched the replay. Not because they had never heard such words before, but because it had been too long since anyone had dared to say them in front of the world. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré kept moving. He didn't linger in interviews. He declined international TV appearances. Instead, he met quietly with farmers in the Sahel region facing climate struggles, with students in Ouahigouya struggling to afford school books, with small businesswomen in Bobo Dioulasso trying to export their crafts. To him, the real response to the insult was not the speech. It was building proof every day that Africa was not a place of pity, but of purpose. In one meeting with a rural women's cooperative, a grandmother placed her hand on his and said, "Thank you for reminding them who we are." Traoré didn't smile. He nodded and said, "I didn't remind them, I reminded us." Meanwhile, across the ocean, reactions were mixed. In Washington, there was no official statement. Trump didn't respond directly, though sources claimed he watched the speech multiple times behind closed doors. One advisor reportedly asked, "Do you want to issue a clarification?" To which Trump allegedly replied, "No need. Let them have their moment." But what he missed was that this wasn't a moment. It was a movement. In Europe, prominent journalists who had once written off Africa as a development case began to reassess their narratives. In France, a primetime panel discussion was dedicated to the Traoré Doctrine. In Germany, youth-led African diaspora groups organized Pride of Roots seminars inspired by the speech. Embassies across the continent received requests for interviews with local inventors, youth leaders, and scientists. People wanted to know more, not just about Traoré, but about the Africa he spoke of. Not the Africa of war and aid, but the Africa of coding camps in Nairobi, fashion hubs in Dakar, green energy startups in Ethiopia, mobile banking revolutions in Kenya, and girls like Aminata, who built light with trash. Traoré had opened a window, and people were finally peering through. But he wasn't celebrating. Late one night, in a private meeting with his closest advisors, he told them, "This moment is powerful, yes, but it is also fragile. If we make this about me, we lose. If we make this about movement, we win." He ordered the creation of a new national program called Voices, Voices of Innovation, Culture, Education, and Sustainability. Its goal was simple: give young Africans the resources to tell their own stories, build their own futures, and reclaim their narrative not through speeches, but through lived reality. Within weeks, Voices was rolled out in 6 regions, offering mentorship, microgrants, and workshops in media, science, and heritage. And still, the world watched. News outlets began referring to Traoré not just as a president, but as a philosopher of dignity. Some compared him to Mandela, others to Sankara. But for him, those comparisons didn't matter. What mattered was that young Africans were no longer asking, "Why do they hate us?" They were now asking, "What can we build next?" He visited a university in Togo and sat in a circle of students. One asked him, "President Traoré, what if they insult us again?" He looked at her gently and said, "Then we will build again. Every insult is a crack, and through cracks the light enters." That line became another quote, printed on shirts used in classrooms, even translated into Braille for visually impaired schools. This chapter in Traoré's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about resurrection. The resurrection of dignity that had long been buried under caricatures and colonial echoes. And though the applause had quieted, the work had only just begun. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not about what one man could say in 5 minutes. It was about what an entire people could live for generations. And so, with every new initiative, every new school built, every young voice amplified, the real reply was unfolding. Not in front of cameras, but in fields, labs, classrooms, and homes. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Ibrahim remembered his mother's words, spoken when he was a boy, and came home crying because a stranger had mocked his dusty clothes. She had wiped his tears and said, "Let them talk, you build." And that truly had become his life's mission. Months passed, but the ripples of Traoré's response didn't fade. In fact, they deepened. The energy that once centered around a single speech had turned into a quiet revolution, a cultural undercurrent stretching far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Something had shifted, not in the halls of the powerful, but in the hearts of the ordinary. Across cities and villages, people began to speak differently, walk differently, dream differently. They weren't waiting to be invited into the global conversation anymore. They were creating their own. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the name Traoré became synonymous not with politics, but with possibility. It was in this time of growing hope that Traoré received an unexpected letter, handwritten, slightly weathered, addressed directly to the presidential office. It came not from a dignitary or ambassador, but from an elderly woman in the Central African Republic. She wrote of her grandson who had dropped out of school after hearing foreign leaders ridicule his homeland. But after watching Traoré's speech, the boy re-enrolled, saying, "If he believes we're more than they say, then I want to be more too." Traoré read the letter 3 times. Not because the words were elegant, but because they were real. And in that boy's change of heart, he saw something more powerful than any policy. He saw evidence of what he'd quietly hoped for all along, that words, when honest, could plant seeds no army ever could. He thought back to the early days of his presidency, the doubt, the weight, the voice inside him that asked if he was strong enough to lead not just with strategy, but with soul. And now, looking out the window of his modest office, he saw lines of children walking home from school, many in uniforms that didn't fit, carrying books twice their size. And yet they walked with purpose. That, to him, was the measure of real leadership, not how loud you spoke, but how deeply you were heard. In private moments, Traoré never spoke of Trump again. To him, the story was no longer about that one man. It was about all the other men and women, boys and girls, who had been made to believe that Africa was something to rise above instead of something to rise from. But he knew there were still battles ahead. The global perception wouldn't change overnight. There would be more insults, more misunderstanding, more backhanded praise disguised as policy. But he had already made his choice. He would not react to every provocation. Instead, he would build schools, build clinics, build leaders. One afternoon, as part of a regional initiative, he visited a youth center in Cotonou, Benin. There, he met a group of teens learning film production. One of them, a 17-year-old girl named Mirembe, showed him a short documentary she'd made titled "My Grandmother is Not a Joke." It was a simple piece, Just her interviewing her grandmother about life, hardship, resilience. But it ended with the old woman looking into the camera and saying, "They laughed at us, but we're still here, and we're still laughing too." Traoré wiped a tear from his eye. Not out of sadness, but recognition. These were the stories that would last. Not the ones written about Africa, but the ones written by Africans. He returned to Burkina Faso later that week and held a private roundtable with young writers, poets, and journalists. No cameras, no scripts, just a question. What story would you tell the world if it finally listened? The answers were raw, unfiltered. One boy wanted to write about how his sister started her own farm. One girl wanted to make a comic book about an African superhero who didn't fly, but healed. Traoré sat with them for hours, not as a president, but as a student. And when he left not just inspired, but affirmed. Then came the international request. A major Western news network wanted to host him for a one-on-one interview about his clapback to Trump. His team advised it might be a good idea, boost visibility, improve diplomatic relations, show strength. But Traoré declined, not because he feared confrontation, but because he didn't want his message diluted into clickbait. If they want to understand us, he told his aides, they should come here, not the other way around. And so the interview never happened. But the world kept watching anyway. In the final months of that year, Traoré launched one last initiative, the Mirror Project, a traveling exhibition that moved through African capitals, showcasing the stories, inventions, songs, and photographs of ordinary citizens who were changing their communities. The slogan was simple: "This is who we are." It was not flashy, it was not funded by foreign donors, but it was honest. And in city after city, thousands came, not to consume content, but to see themselves reflected, to believe that they mattered. And maybe that was the greatest response of all, not the speech, not the policies, but the reawakening of dignity, the reclaiming of identity, the reminder that being mocked by the world means nothing when you know who you are, because when you do, no insult can stick, no stereotype can hold, and no one, not even a president, can define your worth. As the sun set on the last day of the exhibit's first tour, Traoré walked through the gallery alone. He paused in front of a photograph of a barefoot boy carrying a basket of bread. The caption read, "He feeds his family. He is the future." Traoré smiled, then turned to leave. He didn't need to say anything. He had already spoken. The world had heard. This is Malik, and today you've heard not just a story about what was said, but about what was shown. Not about one man's insult, but about a continent's quiet power. Remember, it's not the voice that speaks the loudest that lasts the longest. It's the one that speaks the deepest, and Africa, through Traoré, spoke with the depth of centuries. That is something no microphone, no mockery, no man can ever undo.